It is about 2 in the morning on the 27th of April, 1865. The Mississippi River is running high and cold with spring melt, swollen so wide in places that a man in the water cannot see both banks. 7 miles above Memphis, a steamboat named the Sultana is fighting upstream against that current, with more than 2,000 human beings packed onto a deck built for a few hundred. Most of them are asleep. Most of them are soldiers, Union men, just released from Confederate prison camps and finally pointed toward home. And then, the river lights up like noon. 3 of the boat's 4 boilers let go almost at once. A man standing on the Arkansas shore would later say, "It sounded like 100 earthquakes." The blast tears the center out of the steamboat and throws live coals, splintered timber, and scalding steam into the black sky. Men who had survived Andersonville, who had survived months of starvation behind enemy lines, are killed in their sleep before they can open their eyes. The ones who live are flung into a river so cold and so fast that surviving it will be its own kind of war. More Americans died on the Mississippi that night than died on the Titanic, and history barely noticed. This is the story of how it happened, who let it happen, and why almost no one was ever punished for it. To understand the Sultana, you have to understand what kind of men were on her. The Civil War was ending. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on the 9th of April. Across the South, Confederate prison camps were emptying out, and the men coming out of them were wrecks. They had been held at Cahaba, near Selma, Alabama, and at Andersonville in Georgia, the worst of all the war's prisons. Andersonville was a name that already made men shudder in 1865. It was an open stockade with no barracks and almost no shelter, built to hold a fraction of the men crammed into it. The single creek that ran through the compound served as both the drinking water and the sewer. Prisoners died of dysentery, scurvy, and starvation by the thousands. In a little over a year, roughly 13,000 Union men died inside that fence. The ones who walked out alive in the spring of 1865 were skeletons. Many weighed 90 or 100 pounds. Some could not walk without help. They had buried their friends in trenches and survived on rations a healthy man would have refused. These were the men now being gathered for the trip home. They were marched and shipped to a parole camp called Camp Fisk, just outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, where they waited for the steamboats that would carry them up the river and back to their families in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, and a dozen other states. After everything they had lived through, the worst was supposed to be behind them. They were going home. Some of them had been gone for 2 or 3 years. They had no way of knowing that the most dangerous part of the entire war, for them, was still ahead, tied up at a dock and waiting. For the men who ran the steamboats, those prisoners were not just cargo, they were money. The federal government had agreed to pay the boat owners for every released prisoner they carried north, around $5 for an enlisted man and $10 for an officer. Pack the boat, and you packed it with cash. A full load of paroled soldiers was one of the most lucrative trips a captain could make on the entire river. Every steamboat owner working the Mississippi that spring wanted those men on his deck. The Sultana was a good boat, or had been. She was a wooden side-wheel steamer, 260 feet long, built in Cincinnati in 1863. Only 2 years old, she had 4 boilers, big iron drums running the width of the boat, feeding twin engines that turned the great paddle wheels on either side. Her legal capacity was 376 passengers, plus a crew of about 85. By the standards of the Mississippi packet trade, she was a fine, fast vessel, the kind of boat that ran the route between St. Louis and New Orleans, carrying passengers, mail, and freight. Her master was Captain James Cass Mason of St. Louis, a man with part ownership in the vessel and a strong personal interest in filling her. Mason was not a villain in the cartoon sense. He was a businessman under pressure, a steamboat man who had hit hard times and badly needed a profitable run. and that pressure would kill more people than most battles of the war he had just lived through. In late April of 1865, the Sultana was working her way up the river from New Orleans, carrying a load that included passengers and a cargo of sugar. It was on this trip north that the trouble started. Somewhere below Vicksburg, one of the Sultana's 4 boilers sprang a leak. This was no small thing. A riverboat boiler was a long iron drum full of water heated to violent pressure, and a leak in one meant the metal was failing somewhere. When the boat reached Vicksburg, Mason called in a local boilermaker named R.G. Taylor to look at it. Taylor opened it up and found a section of the boiler that had bulged outward, a place where the iron had grown thin and weak. The right repair, the safe repair, was to cut out the bad sheets of metal and rivet in new ones. Taylor said so. He estimated it would take a few days. A few days was exactly what Mason could not spare. The parole camp at Vicksburg was full of prisoners waiting for transport, and every day Mason sat at the dock was a day a rival boat might come and take his payday. His chief engineer, Nathan Wintringer, knew it too. So instead of the real fix, they pushed for the fast one. Taylor was persuaded to hammer the bulged plate roughly back into shape and rivet a patch over the weak seam. And the patch he riveted on was made of metal thinner than the boiler wall it was covering. Taylor warned them plainly that this was a temporary repair only. Mason assured him the boat would get the full, proper job done once she reached St. Louis. The patch went on. The Sultana would never reach St. Louis. While the boiler was being patched, the loading began, and the loading is where greed turned into a crime. The man in charge of getting prisoners onto boats at Vicksburg was a Union quartermaster officer, Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Hatch. Hatch was, to put it gently, a known quantity. He had a documented history of corruption stretching back through the war. He had been investigated for bribery and graft at Cairo, Illinois, earlier in the conflict. A military commission had examined his record and found him totally unfit for the duties of his office. By every honest measure, Reuben Hatch should not have been within a mile of a government contract. Yet he had been promoted anyway into the post of chief quartermaster at Vicksburg because Hatch had something better than competence. He had protection. His brother was the Secretary of State of Illinois and a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, and over the years, Hatch had collected letters of recommendation from powerful men, including, by some accounts, the President and General Grant themselves. Paper from the right people had kept him out of prison. Now, at Vicksburg, Hatch held the keys to the most profitable cargo on the river, and Captain Mason wanted it all. The accusation that has followed this disaster for more than a century is straightforward. Many historians believe Mason bribed Hatch, promising the quartermaster a secret cut of the government money in exchange for a guarantee that every available prisoner would be loaded onto the Sultana and the Sultana alone. There were other boats at Vicksburg that could have shared the load. They left nearly empty. The prisoners went onto Mason's deck. A second officer, an Army captain named George Williams, was involved in the decision to put all the men on one boat rather than split them up, and there was confusion and buck-passing among the officers about who exactly ordered what. Some of the Army men at Vicksburg actually objected. They could see with their own eyes that the boat was being dangerously overpacked. But the loading went on anyway. The men were counted aboard in long shuffling lines, and the count kept climbing past every reasonable limit. They kept loading and loading. Men crowded onto the main deck, up onto the cabin deck, and all the way up onto the hurricane deck on the very top of the boat. They filled the stairways and the gangways and every open foot of planking. There was barely room to lie down. The weight pressed down so hard that the upper decks began to sag, and the crew had to run heavy wooden support beams up from below to prop them and keep them from caving in. Think about what that means. The boat was so overloaded that it was bending under the men before it ever left the dock, and someone looked at that and decided to cast off anyway. And here is the cruelest part of the scene. The men were happy. They did not know they were in danger. They were going home. After Andersonville, after Cahaba, A crowded deck was nothing. They sang, they told stories. They crowded the rails to watch the river slide by. A clerk and part owner named William Gambrell reportedly told the soldiers that if they reached Cairo safely, it would be the greatest trip ever made on the river. He had no idea how those words would sound a few nights later. By the time the Sultana pulled away from Vicksburg, she carried, by the most careful counts, around 1,950 paroled prisoners, about 24 guards from an Ohio regiment, roughly 70 paying cabin passengers, and her crew of 85. The total came to something near 2,127 people. On a boat legally rated for 376, she was carrying more than 5 times what she was built to hold, sitting low and heavy and top-heavy in a flooding river, her weakest boiler held together by a thin iron patch and a captain's promise. She made Memphis late on the evening of the 26th. The boat took on coal, unloaded a cargo of sugar, and some of the men went ashore briefly. Then, near midnight, the Sultana backed out into the channel and turned her bow north into the current, toward home, with her decks full of sleeping men. She had gone only about 7 miles above the city when the boilers reached the end of what that patch could hold. The explosion came at roughly 2 in the morning. Here is the mechanism, the thing that actually killed them, explained simply. The Sultana's 4 boilers were connected to one another and sat side by side across the width of the boat. She was riding high in the water, overloaded and unstable, and as she pushed against the strong current she rocked, careening from side to side. Every time she leaned one way, the water inside the boilers ran toward the low side, leaving the metal on the high side exposed with nothing but the roaring fire beneath it. Those exposed plates got dangerously hot. Then the boat would roll back the other way and cold water would slam against the overheated metal and flash instantly into steam. The pressure spiked in violent surges, and the weakest point in that whole straining system was the spot where R.G. Taylor's thin patch covered the bulged seam. The metal gave way, one boiler burst, and within a heartbeat the force ripped through the others, and 3 of the 4 let go together. The center of the boat simply ceased to exist. A hole more than 20 feet across was blown open. The 2 tall smokestacks toppled, crushing men beneath them as they came down. Hundreds who had been sleeping directly above and around the boilers were killed in that first second by the blast and by the wall of superheated steam that rolled over them, scalding sleeping men where they lay. Bodies and pieces of the boat were thrown high into the air and came down in the river. Red-hot coals and broken timber rained across the water. One of the survivors who left a written account was a young soldier named Chester Berry, a private from a Michigan regiment who had himself survived Andersonville. Berry was struck in the head by a chunk of flying cordwood, firewood blown loose by the blast, hard enough to fracture his skull. He came to and found the upper decks wrecked and the boat already on fire. Years later, he gathered the stories of more than 100 fellow survivors into a book, so that the country would have some record of what these men went through, even if it would not read it. Because almost immediately, the wrecked wooden boat caught fire. The same blast that tore her open had scattered burning coals from the furnaces through the splintered decks, and the dry old wood took the flame fast. Now the survivors faced a moving wall of fire on a boat in the middle of a flooded river in the dark, and the fire was spreading toward them. For the men who survived the blast, the choice was the cruelest one imaginable. They could stay on a burning steamboat, or they could jump into the Mississippi. The river that night was at flood stage, cold with the spring runoff, and running hard. Many of these men were too weak from prison to swim at all. They jumped anyway, because the fire was coming. The water filled with thousands of people at once, the strong grabbing at anything that floated, the drowning grabbing at the strong and pulling them under too. Men clung to broken planks, to floating debris, to the tops of half-submerged trees standing in the flooded bottomlands along the banks. Some were swept miles downstream in the dark. Many simply gave out from cold and exhaustion and slipped beneath the surface within sight of shore. The river itself was the second killer that night, after the boilers. It was the end of April, the season of snowmelt and spring rain, and the Mississippi was running at flood stage, high and fast and brutally cold. In places, the swollen river had spread out over a mile wide, drowning the low ground along the banks, so that what looked like solid land was only the tops of submerged trees. A strong man in good health can struggle in water that cold for only so long before his arms stop answering him. And these were not strong men in good health. These were former prisoners, half of them barely recovered enough to stand, thrown without warning into a flood in the dark. Some could not swim a stroke. They grabbed at each other and pulled each other under. The lucky ones caught hold of a floating plank or a piece of the wrecked deck or the branches of one of those drowned trees and held on, shaking, waiting for a light to come. A soldier aboard one of the rescue vessels left an account of the sound that has never really been improved upon. A sailor on the gunboat USS Tyler wrote in the ship's log that of all the sounds and noises he ever heard, that was the most sorrowful, men cursing, calling for help, and shrieking in the water. It went on in the dark for over an hour before serious help arrived. The first boat to reach the scene in force, a southbound steamer called the Bostona, did not begin pulling survivors from the water until around 3 in the morning, a full hour after the explosion. Other vessels followed, the Silver Spray, the Jenny Lind, the Pocahontas, and the Navy's ironclad Essex and the Tyler. They hauled the living and the barely living out of the river one at a time, fishing men off driftwood and out of treetops in the cold gray hours before dawn. As the sky began to lighten, the full scale of it came into view. The river for miles below the wreck was dotted with bodies, and with debris, and with the still living clinging to anything that would float. The people of Memphis woke to find drowned and half-drowned soldiers washing up along the banks, some of them carried all the way down past the city by the current. Boats and skiffs put out from shore to pull men in. The burning hulk of the Sultana drifted and finally went down near the Arkansas shore, taking with her everyone who had not gotten off. The survivors were brought into Memphis and laid out in the hospitals and the soldiers' home. More than 500 injured men reached the hospitals, and hundreds more were taken in elsewhere. The wards filled with the burned and the scalded, and their suffering was its own horror. One survivor, William Fees of the 64th Ohio Infantry, remembered that the agonizing cries and groans of the burned and scalded were heartrending and almost unendurable. Men who had endured a year of prison and then survived the explosion and then survived the river died anyway, in clean hospital beds, of burns, and of what the cold water had done to bodies already worn down to nothing. Many who had been pulled alive from the Mississippi died in those beds over the following days and weeks. How many died in all? The honest answer is that we do not know for certain, and historians still argue about it. The numbers that have come down to us range widely. An early Army count put the dead at around 1,200. The United States Customs Service in Memphis recorded 1,547. Later government tallies landed in between. The most careful modern research by the historian Gene Selecker, who spent decades on the question, puts the figure at roughly 1,160. Other accounts have run as high as 1,800. Whatever the exact number, this much is settled fact. It was the deadliest maritime disaster in American history, deadlier than the Titanic would be half a century later, and the great majority of the dead were young soldiers who had already survived the worst the war could throw at them and were within days of walking back through their own front doors. So why have most Americans never heard of it? Why did a catastrophe this enormous, this heartbreaking, vanish from the front pages almost as soon as it happened? The timing answers the question, and the timing is its own grim irony. 2 weeks earlier, on the 14th of April, Abraham Lincoln had been shot at Ford's Theater. He died the next morning. The entire nation was draped in black, consumed by grief and rage. And then, on the 26th of April, the very day before the Sultana exploded, Union soldiers cornered and killed John Wilkes Booth in a Virginia tobacco barn. The hunt for the man who murdered the president had just ended in gunfire. That was the story every newspaper in the country was telling. There is a detail here so bitter it almost seems invented, but it is true. The news of Lincoln's assassination had traveled south down the river, partly aboard the Sultana herself on her way down. Captain Mason had learned of the president's death at Cairo on his way south. The boat that helped carry the news of the nation's grief became, 2 weeks later, the site of a disaster that the very same grief would bury. With Booth's death dominating the headlines and the country still in mourning, the deaths of 17 or 1,800 ordinary soldiers on a Mississippi steamboat were pushed to the inside pages and then, slowly, out of the national memory altogether. But the men who lived through it did not forget, and they wanted someone held responsible. There were investigations, there were inquiries. An inspector named J.J. Witzig examined the wreckage and the evidence and concluded what the survivors already suspected, that the inadequate patch on that boiler had failed under excessive pressure and caused the explosion. The official findings pointed to a combination of causes: the low water in the careening boilers and the faulty repair work done at Vicksburg. The technical cause was clear enough. The human cause was where the system broke down completely. There were boards of inquiry and a court-martial, and what they mostly produced was the spectacle of responsible men pointing at one another. Each officer who had touched the loading at Vicksburg had a reason it was someone else's fault. The boat owners pointed at the Army. The Army officers pointed at each other. The quartermaster who selected the boat pointed at no one, because he simply refused to show up. The only man ever brought to trial and convicted in connection with the disaster was an Army captain named Frederick Speed, who had been involved in organizing the prisoner transport at Vicksburg. He was court-martialed late in 1865 and found guilty of overcrowding the boat. He was sentenced to be dismissed from the service, but the verdict did not hold. The Judge Advocate General, the Army's senior legal officer, reviewed the case and reversed the conviction, on the grounds that Speed had not personally been the one who physically put the men aboard the Sultana. Speed was honorably mustered out of the Army instead. He settled in Vicksburg and went on to become a judge. The one man the system had managed to convict walked away clean. There was another officer, Captain George Williams, who had a hand in ordering all the men onto the single boat. Williams was a West Point graduate and a regular Army officer, and the regular Army closed ranks around its own. He was never punished either. Up and down the chain, every man who could have stopped the overloading and did not, slipped out of reach of any real consequence. And Reuben Hatch, the corrupt quartermaster at the very center of the loading, the man with the history of bribery and the powerful friends, Hatch was never court-martialed at all. When investigators tried to question him, he refused the summons. He had escaped accountability his entire career on the strength of his connections, and he escaped it one last time here. He drifted out of the service and died a few years later, in 1871, of causes tied to drink. Captain Mason, the man who chose the patch and packed the boat, had already paid the only price anyone paid that night. He went down with the Sultana and was never seen again. So in the end, after the deadliest maritime disaster in the country's history, after 17 or 1,800 dead, the accounting came to almost nothing. One conviction, overturned. One guilty captain, dead in the river. One corrupt official, untouched, dead of drink in his bed. No one was ever truly held to account. There is one piece of this story that did reach forward into the world we live in now. Boiler explosions were not rare in those years. In the 1850s, a steam boiler somewhere in America was blowing up on average about once every 4 days. The Sultana was the most horrifying example of a danger everyone in the country lived with. And out of that long fear, the next year, in 1866, a group of engineers in Connecticut founded a company built on a radical idea. Instead of simply paying out money after a boiler exploded and people were already dead, they would inspect boilers rigorously before they would insure them, and refuse to cover the ones that were unsafe. They wrote standards for how boilers should be built and maintained, and how much pressure they could safely hold, and they sent inspectors to enforce them. That approach, insurance tied to inspection and prevention, helped drive the slow march of safety laws that eventually made the steam engine and a great deal of modern industry something you can stand next to without fear. The men of the Sultana did not get justice, but the catastrophe that took them became part of the reason boilers stopped killing Americans by the thousands. The river kept her secret a long time, too. The Mississippi is a restless thing, and over the decades after the disaster, it shifted its channel and moved away from where the Sultana had gone down. In 1982, more than a century later, a Memphis lawyer named Jerry Potter helped lead an expedition to find the wreck. They located what are believed to be her charred remains not in the river at all, but buried more than 30 feet down under a soybean field on the Arkansas side, where the old riverbed used to run. The boat that killed more Americans than the Titanic lies under a farmer's field, with crops growing over the men who never got off her. The last of the survivors lived a very long time. One of them, a Tennessee cavalryman named Charles Eldridge, did not die until 1941, 76 years after the night the boilers blew, an old man who had carried the memory of that cold river into a century of automobiles and radios. The men who came home from the Sultana spent their lives trying to make their country remember what had happened to them, and mostly, they failed. One of them, a survivor named James Kimberlin, put the bitterness plainly. "To be so soon forgotten," he wrote, "does not speak well for our government or the American people." He was right. These were men who had endured Andersonville, who had survived the war, who were close enough to home to taste it. They were killed not by an enemy army, but by a thin metal patch, a crowded deck, and a few men's hurry to turn other men into profit. The next time you hear someone say the deadliest day in American maritime history belongs to the Titanic, remember the Sultana. Remember the soldiers who drowned in sight of the shore 7 miles above Memphis. And remember that the only reason you never learned their names is that the country was looking the other way. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the ones history left out, you know what to do.